Hi, everyone. Come in, take a seat, welcome. Hello to everyone who's joining us hybrid as well. My name is Carly Richmond, and I am here today to talk to you about every developer's favorite topic, testing. I got a couple of laughs, okay. So, for those who don't know me, I'm a senior front-end engineer. I'm also a passionate agilist, and I work at Morgan Stanley. And I'm here today to talk to you about mashups. Not necessarily about music, though, about technology mashups. So often we find as we go ahead and build out software as part of our day jobs or even in spare time for fun, we'll find that there might be one practice we use that, don't get me wrong, it works great on its own, but it's when you combine it with something else that you end up with a far more powerful construct. And I'm going to talk through one such example of this today. I'm going to show you how you can combine the behavioral examples elicited through behavior driven development with your end-to-end testing. I'll discuss why this is important and how it helps you validate the user perspective. We will talk through some code. It is DevOps after all. And I'll also share some best practices that I've observed based on my experiences of using end-to-end tests on their own, as well as with this hybrid. If any questions appear as we go along, do feel free to enter them into Rocket, and we'll get some time at the end to cover those. So, aside from wanting a catchy title, why did I call this the ultimate mashup? Well, it was inspired by music. So, for anyone who's not aware, a mashup is where you take two or more songs together, and you'll combine them together in the hopes of making something a bit catchier. So, for me, growing up kind of late 90s and early noughties, one of the key examples I remember from my childhood was when someone took Christina Aguilera's Genie in a Bottle and combined it with Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit. Not the most complimentary sounding thing. Go find it afterwards and you'll probably see what I mean. But this is a more recent example and a more complementary one, which will get across this thought of complementary practices. So this is Ben Howell. And last year, he took Dua Lipa's Hallucinate, and he combined it with the BBC News theme, so beeping over the background. And it actually worked out pretty well for him. He won Remix of the Year at the BBC Radio 1 Lockdown Awards. And it's Ben's spirit for combining different things with music that I want to embody within technology too. And as I'm hoping you'll come to see at the end of this talk, that's why I justify combining end-to-end testing and behavior-driven development together. So, I imagine a few people in the room and watching hybrid today have heard of end-to-end testing. But for anyone who hasn't, let's reset and all have a common understanding about what this is. So e2e, or end-to-end testing, refers to our ability to test the software from a user workflow perspective. So it's as a user sees it. So normally as developers, we tend to think of end-to-end as more system layers because that's the abstraction at which we're familiar. So we think about end-to-end testing going from your front end through to your middle tier services and then to any data layer at the bottom. And that's certainly one way to mimic the workflow, but as you'll come to see, not always the right one. So when I refer to end-to-end testing, I'm talking about that workflow from when they initially log into your application through all the stages until they achieve their objective and hopefully leave the application. So let's start with an example. Let me explain how these types of tests normally work, at least from a developer perspective. So I'm using Cypress for this, along with the Chai assertion library. Now, the app, which you'll get the GitHub to at the end, is written in Angular, but it's important to note that because Cypress and Chai are JavaScript-based frameworks, we can use them with React or Vue, or even vanilla JavaScript. So, irrespective of where you are in that particular divide, you should be able to find resources online if you want to get started with either of these patterns today. So here's some code. So we have a single spec file here, and in it we've got two tests. But before we do anything, we need to set things up. And this I'm going to show you to give a very brief introduction into some of the key things you would use within the Cypress framework for basic end-to-end testing. So in my before statement, you'll see I'm using Cy, which is basically us invoking Cypress to do its funky stuff. And what it's doing here is it's saying that it's going to visit the home page. Obviously, you can replace this with any particular relative URL of your choosing. I've then got my first test. It's not doing anything that exciting. I'm checking for the title in this particular page. Obviously, this will run after my before statement. But I can use sci.contains, and contains will just try and find it at any point. It doesn't care about any particular DOM-based attributes, classes, IDs, whatever you're using. As long as it's there somewhere, it will find it. And then I've got a final test to basically find out if all my artists are showing on the page. So this is obviously an initial loading statement of a test. And in here, I've got a hard-coded list of artists. And then underneath, I've got sci.get, so I'm wanting to get a particular element out of my DOM here. And I'm actually pulling out anything that matches the record item class. And then what I'm going to do through a basic set of chai assertions is I've got change shoulds, and I'm checking that I've got a total of 3 items in the collection, that I contain each of the texts in turn. And hopefully, if all is well, that will come back as green. So given it's DevOps, I will make assumption that the majority of this audience are developers. So I'm imagining now that we've walked through that, even if you're new to Cypress, you're probably thinking that's not too bad. But what about the other individuals here today that are not developers? And what about the other individuals that you work with? Let's think about Lindsay's point yesterday about empathy, product managers, UX, all those different individuals that you'll work with to build out a product. Do you think this explains the user perspective to them? No. That's how they're going to react. Not that I've tried it, but certainly that's how I imagine they're going to react. They're just going to be wondering what that is. And that's not great. So we need to find a way to better integrate the user perspective into tests, because these non-technical individuals, users, anyone we're eliciting feedback from, needs to be able to understand that we have correctly evaluated the workflow. So how do we do that? There is one way, at least one way that I've found. There might be others that you might be aware of. And for me, it's Behaviour Driven Development. So BDD for short. I'm assuming a lot of people have heard of this term, but it's a practice that basically came out of the test-driven development movement. And it is where features are basically found and formulated in collaboration with key business stakeholders. So individuals that actually know about that user perspective. And we also try and form them in a common language so that everyone can understand, irrespective of where they sit on the technical and non-technical divide. So why combine it with end-to-end testing then? How does this better expose the user perspective? Well, those examples I talked about, I mentioned that they're listed in a common language. And with that common language, we can build that empathy into our tests. And ultimately, as developers, we can actually walk in our users' shoes and see what they actually expect to see when they start to use our software. So let's revisit that example that I talked about before. We're still using Cypress. That has not changed. So that brief overview I gave of some of the key syntax is still useful to us. We're still using chai. That's not changed either. It's actually bundled by default with Cypress as an assertion library. But what's new this time is we are also going to go through and use Cucumber. So Cucumber is a behavior-driven development framework. It is written for multiple languages, including JavaScript, so we can still use it irrespective of if we're using Angular or React or Vue or vanilla JavaScript. The first thing that's noticeably different is we have an example for which we're going to code our tests against. And it's going to look something like this. So in behavior-driven development, we talk about a feature, so that particular workflow that we want to work with. And then, although I've only got one scenario, as you can see on here, I can have multiple scenarios. So I would be able to cover any particular nuances, any particular edge cases, any differing scenarios underneath this feature. And then with the Gherkin specification, which is the orange keywords that you see, I'm able to specify a scenario with a series of givens, whens, and thens. So given, similar to how we think about traditional unit testing, is where we're talking about setting up the initial parameters of the tests. I'm not doing anything exciting here on line 4. As you'll probably come to see, I'm just going to be visiting a page. I've got when here on line 5. I'm not doing anything exciting. I'm literally doing nothing. But this is where you would start to invoke particular user actions in here. So perhaps they've landed on your page and you're an e-commerce app. and you want to filter the set of results by, maybe I'm looking for my dress and my appropriate dress size. That's where the when would come in. I would basically invoke that particular action. And then with my then, which I've got 2 of here, you can have multiples if you like, there's 2 things that I'm looking for. I am checking again for my title. I'm looking to see that that's there in that particular page. But I'm also making use of something called a data table construct in the second then statement. I am looking for a particular set of artists. Now, I've just got it as a single column. If you're representing a more complex construct, then it's just a data table. You would have additional columns represented here in the similar kind of syntax. So for example, if I had to extend my application later on, and I wanted to display more information about the artists, maybe the year they were formed, for example, I can add that directly into my feature specification here. So we're still going to have code, it's just that it's obfuscated and it blends with the user perspective. It blends with those examples that we have formulated together. And in here, I'm making use of the Cypress Cucumber preprocessor, and that basically gives us a very easy way to integrate Cucumber into Cypress with a little bit of configuration. You can even use particular schematics as well, if you'd like to include it in a particular framework-based project that you're currently working on. So the way that it's mapped is we take a step from the preprocessor, and we will map it to a given expression. And that's the expression that's going to live within our feature file. So the example I'm highlighting here is given I am on the home page, which is going to correspond to the exact same expression that was listed in our feature file we've just walked through. And then you'll see that I've mapped it to a given callback function, and I'm calling my visit page again. So it gives me a lot more expressive language as to how I expect the system to behave, even at this code layer. You'll also see for my first then statement that I can then pass in expressions, which is a great form of reuse. We're not having to duplicate a lot of boilerplate code across the different tests, similar to what we might have for the unit testing-based format. And in here, what you'll see is that I'm passing in the string with curly braces, and that tells it that I need to pass in a particular title parameter, and then I'm just running contains. So this could scale, perhaps, if I wanted to reuse it, not just within multiple scenarios of a feature, but I could also potentially reuse this if I wanted to replicate common behavior across all of the workflows that I'm attempting to validate. It's also worth noting that we still have support for the data tables. So we've again got really strong reuse here. So I'm passing in a table definition, which is the construct that Cucumber provides to me. And what I'm able to do with that is directly pull out the artist rather than resorting to the hard-coded list that I had before. Oops. And then what you'll see on line 22, we can still pass in rather complex CSS expressions as we choose. But here, I'm still checking that I would expect the artist collection of a length of 3. I'm still checking for each of those values to come back. But the difference is that I've chained, there's a slightly different syntax where you can chain multiple expects within a single should, rather than chaining each individual should, which is what we had in the prior example. So we've talked through examples. I'm hoping now you're starting to see why these examples are powerful and why they are helpful in exposing the user perspective in your tests. However, there's more to it than that. I've been working with these types of tests on and off for a couple of years now. And with that particular experience also comes some lessons, some that came from doing things the right way the first time, and some, which are far more interesting, normally from doing it totally wrong. So here, I'm now going to share some best practices that, irrespective of the code we've just walked through, you should think about with this particular blend of end-to-end and behavior-driven development tests, but also if you're doing normal end-to-end testing, or actually just thinking about testing more generally within your applications. So first thing to warn you about, beware of technical jargon in those feature files. Now, it might sound a bit strange because you said, well, Carly, you're formulating these as part of, with stakeholders and with the user perspective. So why would the technical jargon get in there? It's my experience quite commonly that as technologists, we normally end up pushing behavior-driven development and encouraging it within our practice. partially because it's a shiny thing to try out, but also because we can see it's going to have real value. But with that, sometimes we end up inadvertently adding our own technical perspective of how it's meant to function. So examples I've seen in my own feature files include things like, given the database has the following data. I do know a lot of users know what database is. Certainly I've had that experience. But the other one I've heard of, which they just don't understand, is given I invoke this particular REST endpoint. Users don't really understand APIs. So we need to change that. We need to make sure that it's a common language, so that it's something that is more driven from the domain in which your application is intended to operate. So for example, those two that I've just talked about, if we wanted to replace given the database has following data, consider that to be given I have the following financial transactions, or I have the following products, basically whatever the objects or entities are that you're modeling within your system. And then given I have invoked the following REST endpoint, that to me says that there's probably an action that's being triggered off the back of that. So it's definitely worth changing the language to mimic that action instead of mimicking what the system does. Hey. So I'm hoping a few people have heard of what I like to call the testing ice cream cone. I came across this term quite recently, and I actually quite like it. So normally we talk about the testing pyramid. And anyone who's not familiar with this, it's a term coined by Mike Cohen. And it's basically meant to showcase the ratio of the different types of testing that you should have within your system. And there's twofold reasons for that. Partially, it's because normally the time to execute this given test suite actually increases as you go up the pyramid. But the other thing is the time to develop them also increases the further you go up the pyramid. So we normally advocate that the width of the triangle at that layer denotes the proportion of unit tests, proportion of tests that you should have. So here are my unit tests. I should have more of those than of my integration tests, and the same thing with end-to-end. But sometimes when we start writing end-to-end tests, or we get really excited about using a new testing methodology, it does happen. We inadvertently tip the scales. So you end up flipping it upside down, having higher coverage between your end-to-end suite compared to your unit tests, and you end up with the testing ice cream cone. A prior team I actually worked in had probably closer to the testing ice cream sandwich, which was where their coverage for unit and end-to-end was pretty much the same. Irrespective, it's not good. It introduces problems. End-to-end tests are more brittle. They're more likely to break than your unit suite. They also take longer to run. So if you have a higher proportion of these, you're increasing your time to develop, which is not what the intention of these suites are. The intention of end-to-end suites is to automate user-focused testing. So just beware of the testing ice cream cone and make sure that you're regularly checking in on the proportion of each of these tests that you have. We went through a lot of effort. I mean, these examples, we're regularly formulating them with users. We're not just kind of throwing them away, we're doing something with them, and it's a practice that you will keep doing over time. So it doesn't really make sense to me that we should obfuscate them off once we get to the testing result stage. We should be proud of the fact that we've automated some user testing. It should be something that we share far and wide. And it's also something that we can use as a common discussion point when it comes to planning the next release, or getting the go-ahead for maybe an experimental feature to go out. So you should expose your test results in a user-friendly format. I have experience using Cypress, obviously we've talked about that today, and a bit of Preprocessor too. And irrespective of the end-to-end testing framework you use, most of them, if not all of them, come with some form of reporting plugin that you can use. So for Cypress, for example, I'm aware you can use multiple different screenshot-based reports. And Cypress even comes with MP4 recording out of the box, so it actually records your test result execution. And we should show these, we should use them. In addition to providing a common point for validation, they actually also can be used in other ways. I can see uses for them in terms of technical writers building documentation. They can embed those MP4s in there. Or perhaps you can use it for run the suite as part of a ready for business check. Very carefully, obviously. Last thing you want is to inject a bunch of test data into production. We all know how badly that goes. If we remember Helen's talk about night capital, just don't do it. So make sure you expose those results in a user-friendly format. Let's take advantage of them and use them as a regular verification point. Integrate them into your continuous integration pipelines early. This might sound a bit obvious, but it's not. You should use your tests as a gating mechanism to stop any failing suite from making it through to the next stage in your pipeline. But often when we start with these tests, we do it as a proof of concept just to try something out. And in the case where my team originally did this, what we ended up doing was created a custom Jenkins job on our pipeline that would run against the testing environment. And we were happy with ourselves because it was running directly against the testing environment and it was a useful verification point. But half the time we didn't remember to run it until either just after that particular environment had been updated to the latest version, or even a couple of times a lot longer after that. And that's not a great time to find out that your test suite has failed, because you have to go all the way back to the start, you have to fix your test, and then you have to push it all the way back through the pipeline again. And that's a waste of productivity. So as much as we don't like to see it fail, it should be failing as early as possible. You should be integrating failure into your first PR stage if possible, and use it as a verification for each environment as you go as well. Now, this last one might be a bit contentious, and certainly you could probably write a talk on it on its own. But we should be okay with using mocks and stubs. Towards the start, when we were talking about end-to-end testing, we talked about it's a common thought that for us as developers, it refers to system layers. And that means that we inadvertently enforce that it would be run later in our process because we need to ping directly against the services when they're instantiated. But actually, it's a good thing to consider for local development, and you need to build the test to start with anyway. So if you have a suite that's running against a testing environment from a local development stage, what's going to happen if you have a rather unfortunate Friday afternoon when that testing environment goes down? Yeah, you're going to be sitting twiddling your thumbs, and you're probably going to feel really frustrated that you're trying to get the last feature out before you head out for the weekend. Cypress and other end-to-end testing frameworks do provide capabilities to help with this. They can provide environment-specific configuration so you can override stubs with legitimate system calls at particular points in time. You can also make use of the stub capabilities or mocking frameworks within them. And to be honest, you could also use a mock server. You could have a simple mock node server running, paying the calls. The point isn't necessarily, irrespective of what you choose to do, that you end up mocking at a particular point. And this also applies to different forms of transports as well. So I'm aware of Cypress having additional plugins for things like WebSocket support. So it's not always a valid reason that, oh, well, we're not using REST, so we can't override it with the default stubs. If you're using more complex transports, there's most likely a plugin or some other equivalent for you to be able to override if needed. So, just like a coda in music, we've reached the end of this talk. Woohoo! So let me summarize what we've learned today. We've learned that end-to-end testing, combined with behavior-driven development and the examples that are enlisted from it, is a good mashup. It allows you to expose the user perspective in those end-to-end tests and make it to be a common dialogue between yourselves as developers and any other non-technical or other stakeholders that you work with. We've talked about best practices based on getting it right and getting it wrong. And we've also walked through an example. If you scan the QR code up there, you'll get access to the GitHub repository, which has the combined specification, and you can have a play with it. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me today. It was lovely to speak to people in person, as well as to our hybrid folks. If you want to reach out just to say hi or to ask any questions, that's my handles there for LinkedIn and Twitter. Again, there's a reminder of the QR code. And otherwise, we can hand over to questions on Rocket. Now, do we have any? If not, I can take some in the room. I see a hand.
Question regarding the discussion between logging and non-logging. So in your example, the test that you displayed was an end-to-end test where the data is static, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we always expect the same title and the same values.
Mm-hmm.
For dynamic data,
Yeah.
where like the most played Spotify results, right? And the data will change.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any advice or best practices? Is the only solution here like mocking the data, or that's the only one I would think of? Like, do you know any best practices to handle end-to-end tests?
So handling tests for kind of larger complex data sets compared to really small examples, is that what your question is?
Where the data is dynamic and we cannot guarantee that the title will always be, or the list of artists will always be the same.
Okay, so dynamic data.
Yeah.
Oh, no, that is a question. I think the way that I would potentially handle that, I mean, it would be interesting what the source would be for a dynamic data set. So that might be something worth thinking about. I guess one thing you could potentially do is, rather than having a data table and the construct there, one thing you could potentially do is have some sort of given statement that will have a corresponding generator in the background for whatever you need it to do. The only kind of caveat and caution I would take with that is that with dynamic tests, with dynamic data sets like that, I would be slightly cautious about introducing non-determinism into your test suite. It's difficult to know without having more information about that particular use case and why that data is in fact dynamic. But certainly if there was a way for, if you were needing to do that and you were kind of sure that you weren't going to introduce non-determinism, then potentially you could have just a given statement, like given I have the following positions, and rather have a data table, you can have a corresponding function in the background that will do the generation. Does that answer your question? Cool. We got one on the app?
Yeah, we have two.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Right, so we have 2 questions. Does Cypress suffer from flaky tests like other frameworks, and how do you deal with flaky tests? This is a wonderful question. So in my experience, I have found that Cypress is a bit more reliable. So in fact, in the team I used to work in, we originally had Preprocessor, and we had a lot of problems with that being really flaky. I don't know if anyone else has experience of that. But what we found with Cypress is the retrying logic within it operates different to Preprocessor. So it will keep retrying to do things for a certain period of time. And in fact, you can tweak the timeout as well. And in that particular instance, that means that you're trying to reduce the amount of flakiness. The other reason that your test can potentially be flaky with Cypress, excluding the retry logic, is that potentially you've got your ratio is off with the testing pyramid. So that was another problem that we had as well. And in that instance, it might be that you're trying to cover individual units, or you're covering maybe a short-term workflow, and you should consider looking at a longer workflow. So Kieran, I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, please feel free to reach out. And then Dennis has a question. The examples have the domain user constructs mixed with code. This will not be really useful for non-technical stakeholders. Can they not be in 2 different files? The examples have the domain user constructs mixed in with code, and this will not be useful. I'm not sure I agree with that one. I'm certainly happy to take it offline. So obviously the examples, you need to have, by domain here, I think we're talking about the domain, the problem domain, the modeling domain itself, which should be a common thing between yourselves as technical stakeholders and non-technical stakeholders. So for example, thinking about my own experiences, we have knowledge of financial transactions, which is a common thing across both parties. So that kind of technical jargon is legitimate because it refers to the domain of the system, not necessarily the domain in terms of a technical execution. You could hypothetically put them into 2 different files. You can structure your features however you want. You can also have different test files in TypeScript or JavaScript separated out, so it's definitely possible. So I'm hoping, Dennis, I've answered your question. If not, can you reach out and we can have a chat further? Cool. Right. 1 minute, so one more question. I can see yourself in the middle.
Yeah, you mentioned, I guess, your test pyramid, like the simpler test, unit tests go on the bottom, and then more complicated, broader texts sort of go on top, and you sort of have less of those. And I guess it makes sense that you would have less of those because they take more time to write.
Yes.
In terms of what it looks like for developer time spent on testing at the the different levels, does the developer time look less like a pyramid, or does the developer time also look like a pyramid in that you should spend more time writing unit tests than end-to-end? Or should you spend an equal amount of time on all of them, and then because end-to-end tests will take longer to write, it'll look like a pyramid?
That's an interesting question. I'd never thought about the time taken. Because certainly if you think about end-to-end tests compared to unit tests, in my experience, the end-to-end tests do take longer to write because normally you're covering a multi-stage workflow. So you're thinking about a larger construct compared to a smaller component. So I would expect that end-to-end tests are probably going to take you longer to write more generally. Certainly another factor to consider in addition to time to write would also be time for the suite to run. So if you're using it as a gate within your CI pipeline, for example, that's going to mean that it's going to take longer for yourselves as developers for waiting for it to go through, waiting for your builds to pass. You can utilize parallelization frameworks. So for example, Cypress has something called Sorry Cypress, which you can use to parallelize it within the pipeline. So that's another thing that wasn't directly what you asked, but it probably relates to the question. But it is a fair point. End-to-end, I've generally found that you'll tend to spend a bit more time writing end-to-end tests compared to unit tests, but for less coverage. I hope that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Sort of, I guess.
Sort of.
I guess I was wondering, as developers that are doing this, right? I mean, you can say that we want this pyramid, but in terms of like actually spending your time, should you expect to spend the same amount of time writing your integration and end-to-end tests as you do unit tests? Right, like in total, right? Like obviously every code change needs unit tests, not every code change needs integration and end-to-end tests.
Yeah, that's totally true. It probably does balance out. I imagine you'd spend more time generally writing the unit compared to the end-to-end as a ratio, given that regard, because you're right, there's more benefit in spending more time on your unit tests. So I would expect that. So I think your assertion is potentially correct. But again, the other thing is, I guess, teams need to agree together how they're going to do that. So are they comfortable with that kind of ratio of time? And is there like some sort of flag in your head going off saying, well, it took me this long to write this suite, maybe this particular end-to-end workflow suite, maybe it's actually too complicated and we maybe need to split it. So that's another thing to consider as well. Cool. Right, we are out of time, but I will be around for the rest of the day. If anyone wants to come and ask me any further questions, please feel free. Any hybrid people, you can reach out at the handles too. Thank you very much, everyone.